welcome back to my channel, and welcome if you are new. So I have been doing a bit of research because sometimes when I put things like book pages and ephemera that I find into junk journals, I'm unsure as to whether they are vintage or not vintage or antique, and so I decided to do a bit of research and find out, and I was quite surprised. So what I've learned, I think, was from an Australian website. So I don't know whether this is the same internationally, or whether different countries have different guidelines. But this is coming from Antique Experts. So this is what I found out. And this goes for all antiques, not just books. So the definition of vintage is anything that is older than 20 years. So we're in 2024 now. So anything prior to 2004 would actually be vintage. I mean, I've got stuff that is from the 80s and the 90s, and I thought, oh, they're not vintage, but they actually are vintage. So above 20 years is under the scope of vintage. And then you've got a subdivision of vintage, which is called true vintage. Now, it doesn't mean the other ones aren't vintage. They are vintage. But true vintage is over 50 years. Okay, so anything over 50 years is also vintage, but it's classed as true vintage. Okay, and then we've got antique. So anything above over 100 years old is classed as antique. Okay, so I've got out some examples here of just a few things that I've got. Now, where I am in Australia, I can get hold of vintage, but probably not as easily as in the UK or the US. They obviously have a lot more history than us, and it is a lot easier to get hold of these things. It's extremely hard to get hold of true vintage and antique here in Australia. But I have been lucky to something was sent to me which is antique, which I'll share with you. But I also have some true vintage and vintage. So I'm just going to show you what I have. So I have this book here, which is the poems of Shakespeare. It's got sonnets and things like that. And I wanted to, I thought it'd be nice to add, oh, excuse me, sorry, yawning already. I thought that I would add some poetry to each of my journals, just a page of poetry, and being Shakespeare, I thought that would be really nice. And I thought to myself, well, I don't think this is vintage, but, I wonder if it is. And so I've looked in here, and this edition is 1994. So that's greater than 20 years. So yes, this book is vintage. Okay. It was first published in 1898. So, I mean, if you had a first edition, you would have an antique. But this book is vintage. Okay. So that's that. And then the other day, and I was really happy about this, I came across this in a second-hand shop, or in America, I think you call them thrift store. We call them opportunity shop, op shop, or second-hand store. And it is, sorry, I can't fit it all in the camera, but it's a collection of embroidery, or embroidery patterns And it has lots of little samples of embroidery in here that someone's actually done. And there's lots of little ones. This is a little embroidery, you know, it's a piece of, that's actually embroidery cloth in the centre. So I thought, you know, I could include that in a journal, or I could try out the embroidery myself. So there's that, and then there's this one here, some more embroidery cloth. There's lots of embroidery patterns. And there's a real one there that someone's done. And some of them, there's a little bird there, isn't that gorgeous? But yeah, I wasn't going to show you the whole thing, but I looked at the dates. Now these go from, I think the latest is 1992. And some of them are from the 1980s. And in the back here, I have some pages that look very vintage. But they are, I would assume, from the 80s as well, because this whole folder is from, when I look at the dates, it's late 80s, early 90s. And there's some threads in there too. And so they are vintage. They're prior to 1994. But these are actually from the New Idea, I'm assuming back in the 80s. It's a magazine we have in Australia. And they are iron-on transfers. Beautiful thin aged paper here. So iron-on transfers which haven't been used. So I'm going to include them in some journals, and then some vintagey looking things here. Sorry, embroidery patterns. But they look like they also would be from the late 80s or early 90s, because everything that's dated on here is. So that's, you know, some vintage ephemera that I found. And, you know, I was thinking, you know, if I put it in a journal, could I call it vintage ephemera? And then when I did my research, I found out, yes, I can, because it is vintage ephemera. So there's another example. Now, another example is this book that I've had for quite a long time. And now this book is older than me. No, sorry, it's not older than me. It's the same age as me. It came out in the year I was born. And it is true vintage. So there you go. I am true vintage. Now, it's a book called The Age of Renaissance. And I paid a fair bit for it secondhand. It's true vintage. It's all about the Renaissance. It's all sort of Renaissance and what I would call, I can't think of it now, but beautiful for a Renaissance journal. I mean, look at all the art. It's got lots and lots of Renaissance type art, pictures. It's just beautiful. And some of it I have torn out, as you'll see, and used it occasionally, but I haven't used it much because I've been hoarding it, because I just love it. So this is 1967. So this book is true vintage. It's just got some of the most beautiful images. And I have pressed some flowers in it later on. I have pressed some flowers. I was just sort of experimenting because it's a nice heavy book. And I've got some leaves here and things like that, which I'm planning on making some specimen cards out of. So they're in there. So that is an example of true vintage. Now, as I said, as far as antique goes, which is over 100 years old, I haven't managed to get hold of many, but I had this little book here. And this little book here was gifted to me a few years ago. I have not used it at all because I just love it so much. I've been afraid to use it. But it was gifted to me by Melissa Barnes. And she has her own YouTube channel here. She's in my Facebook group and she was on my design team for a while. It's called Tennyson's Ideals of the King. Eclectic English classics. But I'm not sure what it's all about, but you can see in the front here someone's taken a lot of notes. Some more old writing here. But I had a look, and this book was published in 1900 and 1904. So it is definitely antique. It's over 100 years old. And look at the writing, I mean the typing in it. I just love it. It's antique kind of, almost typewriter writing. You know, there's some writing in here. And it's quite well kept. It's got nice delicate paper. But yeah, so over 100 years old. This is classed as antique. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to share in this video. Just a quick video to, in case you're making junk journals or whatever and you weren't sure whether your pages were vintage or not, or antique. So there you go. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.